Napoleon was a French general, later emperor, who revolutionised military organisation and training. He saw successes all the way from Germany to Europe, only being defeated by a coalition of countries at the Battle of Waterloo, a battle so famous that ABBA made a song about it. But you see, I was curious. Was Napoleon actually that good of a general? Well, I have decided to see just how feasible his conquests were in the totally legitimate and unbiased game of Hearts of Iron 4. Stick around to the end to see just how well I perform. Will I obtain victory or be completely crushed? Okay, so the first question you may be asking yourselves is how exactly am I going to LARP as Napoleon? Well, as usual, everything comes down to the focus tree. I will start off with the focus Revive the National Bloc, and then work my way down to the Council of Rambouillet. From there, I will proclaim the Third Empire and conquer all those who stand against me. However, before I can even think about conquering my neighbours, I need to build up my industry and fill up my under-equipped divisions. There wasn't really any plan on where I was going to build my factories, so I chose to go big or go home. And in all honesty, except for working down the focus tree, that was pretty much all the preparation I needed before becoming the French Empire. And this is really just because I'm already a major nation. I have loads of divisions, I have loads of civilian factories, I have loads and loads of stuff, so I didn't have to actually do too much to catch up with my surrounding neighbours. Just before I was about to become the French Empire, however, I had noticed that the fascist civil war had ignited in the UK. This means that the UK will be at its weakest possible point, so I immediately chose to create naval invasions so that once I had my war goal on the UK, I could attack without giving them any time to prepare, ensuring their easy capitulation. And there it was, I had now successfully formed the French Empire, allowing me to now complete the focus Avenge Waterloo, a focus that would give me a war goal on the entirety of the Benelux region and of the United Kingdom. And like I said earlier, the UK was pathetically weak, crippled to the point of not even having the strength to put their navies in the Channel, allowing for me to cross and make landings at Plymouth and other areas of Cornwall and Devon, cutting off the entirety of the southwest, allowing for me to station a forward operating base. Upon landing, I rushed to secure access to as many ports as possible to ensure my troops were supplied and to also ensure that I could flood in extra divisions to bolster my front line, but to be honest, the extra troops were not needed in the slightest. The British Isles was abandoned, allowing for me to walk from victory point to victory point without issue. The few divisions that I did encounter were simply destroyed, crushed before they could put up a proper fight. And that was the story of the Brits. In the peace deal I puppeted them, and since I had now defeated one member of the coalition, all that was left was to wipe out the others. However, before I could wipe out the rest of the coalition, I had to gain control of the strategic region of the Benelux, to make sure that when the time is right, I could attack the Germans on as many fronts as possible. Now this is a 1938 Benelux, so they obviously didn't put up much of a fight. As soon as I pierced their lines in the south, I rushed to outflank their divisions, leading to a large encirclement and the Belgians' capitulation. In the peace deal, I chose to puppet them. I'm going to choose to do this for as many nations as possible, just so I can save on the garrison costs as much as possible. I then attempted to repeat my previous successes in the Netherlands, and initially things were working out fairly well for me. However, everything changed when the Germans attacked, stealing the north away from me and thus preventing me from having a clean border to attack the Germans from in the future. Unfortunately, I had made an error. When I invaded Luxembourg, I didn't pay enough attention to the fact that they were in the Czech Entente, meaning I was now at war with Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia and eventually Italy once they too joined the Entente. This meant I had to put my German plans on hold. Thankfully, however, I was not alone in this war, as I had not only my vassals but also the Germans fighting alongside me. Initially, I had hoped for the Germans to crush the Entente on their own. However, for whatever reason, the Germans were being pushed deeper and deeper into their own lands. If Germany collapsed, I would be in a lot of trouble, so I bolstered the German front lines with my own troops in an attempt to solidify the lines and eventually push the Czech Entente back. And I held that line good and proper, only giving up tiles when I absolutely had to. At this rate, our victory was guaranteed. Or at least it was until the Germans attacked Poland. Now, this didn't have as drastic of an effect as it probably should have. However, our lines were definitely now under a greater strain, making our defences far more prone to collapse, so I definitely had to pay closer attention to the red bubbles that kept popping up. Annoyingly enough, the Portuguese also joined the Czech Entente, but instead of actually fighting for my African colonies, I just left them to die. They didn't really contain any decent factories for me to hold on to, and I didn't actually have enough troops to properly enforce the third front line anyway, so it would have just been a complete waste of manpower and effort to hold on to those colonies. I did still, however, try and hold on to the ports in Africa, just in case I ever needed to do a naval invasion. Back in Europe, the Italians had grossly overextended their lines, meaning that with the assistance of sufficient cash, I pierced through the Italian Alps. Now, this was incredibly important. So far in this war, we had only been losing land to the Entente. However, now we were finally taking it. And more importantly, we were taking it from the Italians, a major nation that once capitulated would drastically weaken the Entente's front lines in Germany. If the Italian troops die, the rest of the front line will also collapse. This initial push that I did into Italy was wildly successful, as it allowed me to cut the Italians in half, isolating the northern front line from the southern one, cutting the Italian army in two and isolating them from their allies. After this initial push, I moved into Austria, pushing until I had the Entente's northern front lines nearly encircled. It was beautiful. The fact that I had weakened the Entente so much also breathed some life into the Germans, giving them the strength to push against the Entente as well. In the end, it was me and the Germans pushing against an Entente that was the husk of its former self. I cleared up a final few Entente pockets and then left the east of Europe to be dealt with by the Germans, because you have to remember the point of this video. We are trying to destroy the coalition, and Germany was once in this coalition when Prussia was a thing. We need Germany weak. We can't have them too weak because they still have to deal with the Entente, but they also have to be weak enough where we can easily deal with them. Before betraying Germany, however, I knew I would have to fully defeat the Italians first, as if I was to go to war with too many majors at once, I would be stretched far too thin and be unable to attack effectively. So, I pushed down the western coast of Italy in order to ensure I created as many encirclements as possible on the east coast, to ensure the Italians never had enough divisions to mount a successful counterattack against me. And that was now the end of the Italians, wiping their troops from the map, crippling the Entente further. After dealing with the Italians, I realised that the Germans were at war with the Russians, so I decided to assist them one last time in taking out Czechoslovakia before finally betraying them, and getting revenge for Waterloo. And it turns out knocking out Czechoslovakia was all that was needed to topple the entirety of the Entente, triggering a peace deal. In this peace deal, I puppeted Italy and took the Netherlands for myself, and I also stole everyone's navies to ensure that France was the one who now ruled the waves. All that was left was to enlist more men into my air force and to stockpile some equipment into my warehouses. With this last bit of preparation, I will be able to stab Germany in the back, all while they are busy waging a war against the Soviets. Germany has been fighting for the last couple of years. They cannot afford to fight a second war on two separate fronts. It was now time to begin the war. My troops are on the border and my planes are in the skies, making sure my men will only fight under the greatest of greens. The initial strategy that I used against the Germans was to battle plan and pray, and on the Benelux front line it was working incredibly well. I also had some success down in Italy, however this was only a secondary line, so I didn't pay massive attention to it. Returning to the north where I was having the most success, and I had managed to encircle an absolutely humongous amount of divisions. This is an absolutely devastating blow to the Germans, as they were already getting overrun both in the east and the west, but now they were getting overrun and they had only half the army to fight back with. 1 month later, and I'd managed to get a second smaller encirclement, and it was at this point that all I could do was pity the Germans. I no longer viewed them as an enemy. The 1000-year Reich had been completely crushed, and all that was left to do was to try and capture Berlin before the SSSR so that I could get as many victory points in the peace deal as possible. And just like that, I had captured Berlin, beating the SSSR in the race for Berlin. I then captured a few more victory points, causing the capitulation of the Germans, getting revenge on both Prussia and the Austrian Empire at the same time. 3 out of the 4 coalition members had now been crushed, and the final one left standing was the Russians. However, the Russians were not alone, for they had the Spanish on their side. If I wanted to wage war against the Russians, then the capitulation of the Spanish would have to be my priority. However, this would require me to split my army in two. While it was guaranteed that I had over double the size of the Spanish army, it was also guaranteed that the full size of the Russian army would absolutely outclass whichever half of my army that I put on the European front line. I would be condemning half of my army to death if I was to play my cards wrong. However, I had a plan. I would fly as many planes as feasibly possible over both front lines, and on the Russian front line I would bunker down and wait out the storm. I would most likely lose many tiles with this plan, however it should buy me enough time to deal with the Spanish. After the Spanish capitulate, I will be able to unify my armies against the Russians and drive them back past the Urals. The plan was now set into motion and the clock was ticking. I began with an all-out assault across the entire Spanish line, with the goal being to pin as many Spanish troops down as possible to allow me to have an easier time at piercing their front line by preventing any reinforcement from happening. While yes, I was losing land to the Soviets, I was also taking land from the Spanish at a far greater rate. For now, the plan was working. And it actually continued working as well. I was able to push the Spanish further and further back, even into the land that was once held by the Portuguese, and once I took the city of Cordoba, the Spanish capitulated, freeing up an entire 50% of my armies. An entire 50% that I then immediately used to reinforce my crumbling Russian front line. However, I had made a mistake. I had been far too trigger happy with the battle plans and suffered greater casualties to the SSSR than I had expected. While I could easily replace the equipment lost by my divisions, I could no longer replace the lives. This greatly reduced the fighting strength of my divisions, making them far weaker in combat. My chances at defeating the Soviets had reduced even more. However, I didn't let this deter me from challenging the SSSR. I consolidated my forces and lined them up along the front line for one last battle. I started my offensive in the north, taking tile after tile from the Soviets until I managed to pull off a complete encirclement. If we are lucky, we will be able to pull off multiple encirclements. However, it is still too early in the war to guarantee my victory. However, we may be able to speculate, as I managed to create a second encirclement around Prague and Pilsen, trapping well over 15 divisions. 15 divisions that the Soviets will no longer be able to use to reinforce their front line. I faced victory after victory against the SSSR. However, I was still facing two detrimental issues: my manpower and my war support. With a low war support, I will be unable to go onto the higher conscription laws, and without the higher conscription laws, I will simply be a bulldozer without any fuel, incredibly powerful and efficient, yet unable to function. My victories against the USSR are only in the present. I cannot guarantee future success without any manpower. I was forced to delete half my army to try and conserve manpower, and while this did give me over 300,000 men, this would not be enough to fuel my campaigns. I attempted to cut the SSR in half in order to pull off the greatest encirclement known to man. However, I had run out of steam while trying to attempt this. I do not have the strength to close the encirclement, forcing me to concede to a stalemate between me and the SSSR. In the end, I wiped out 3 of the 4 coalition members, and I drew with the 4th, hence allowing me to say that I am a better general than Napoleon. The only way that I could see myself beating the SSSR is if I had more divisions. However, due to the lack of manpower, this simply wasn't possible. I guess waging multiple wars against multiple majors for over a decade was a bit too ambitious. Anyway, here's a picture of my dog, and I would like to thank each and every one of you for watching to the end.